here and get started. Well, welcome back, folks. The second week, and it is snowing outside, so what better day than today to talk about research methods. I did send a message out today about textbooks. If somebody's still having a problem getting the textbook, there is a free copy I found online for the 12th edition. The content of the chapters doesn't change. It looks like, though, in the most recent, there's a 15th edition, that some of the questions have changed. I said that if you did happen to do a question that's different than the one I wanted you to do, it's fine. You, of course, will still get credit. But I would, though, like to talk about the first question that I wanted people to take a look at. Now, recall that you don't have to do all of these chapter questions. I forget how many I said on the syllabus that you had to do out of the number of assignments, but just take a look at that. It's on the Moodle page. But anyway, I'll go ahead and read the question out loud, and this is the one anyway that was in my book. I think it's the same for all the editions going back quite a ways. I guess changed the 15th. But anyway, the question that was posted here in the version of the book I have anyway, it says, review the common errors of human inquiry discussed in this chapter. Find a magazine or newspaper article, or perhaps a letter to the editor that illustrates one of these errors, and discuss how scientists would avoid it. And so these things are very common. You turn on cable news for 5 minutes, you're going to catch people making ad hominem arguments, so attacking the person or their personality and not the really quality of their arguments. And we went through a bunch of these. They're in the chapter. They're also in the baloney detection kit. The floor is yours. Who found something interesting they would like to share? And if you did happen to answer a completely different question, let's save it until afterwards, and we'll address that as well, because all of it will deal with content in chapter 1 anyway. So who has something they want to share about finding one of these clearly a logical error in thinking, or just kind of full of baloney type statements that we see in lots of popular media?
I found one that was on the political race in 2016 of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. I think it was Huffington Post, but it was just like a real early prediction, like pretty much right when the polls started coming in. So they mentioned that Hillary Clinton had, like, I think it was like a 97% chance of winning. I just wrote how that's just like an overgeneralization that, especially in polling, you can't really make predictions that early on, especially drastically like that, mentioning 97% chance of winning.
Yeah, the data at the time could not have possibly led to that specific of a prediction. I mean, 97%. I mean, clearly that's just being said for effect. So very good. Yeah, Tyler, you said you had one?
Yeah, I did mine for politics too, and I noticed a bunch of other people mentioned politics for overgeneralization seemed like the big one.
Okay.
Just when they mentioned like the Republicans, like they just use Republicans and Democrats so loosely and kind of just infer that it's like every member of the party. Like I don't know, it's just, it seems like it's for, I don't know, just for their media sake. I don't know.
Yeah, you see a lot of this, what we would say in the sciences are logical fallacies, taken as sort of the norm in political discussions, where people clearly are more interested in generating heat than light when they have a so-called debate. It's like the debates that were going on. It's not just that debate between Biden and Trump that was a total shit show, really. I mean, I don't know what else you want to call it. But if you go back to earlier presidential debates, I mean, they were not that bad, but they really were more about people trying to kind of generate controversy and or get under people's skin, get the emotions going, rather than generating any sort of light that is bringing more attention or more information or more data to people that would be useful. So this kind of stuff is really quite commonplace. What else did Jared, and then we'll take some others. Yeah.
I found an article on Sheriff David Clark, and he was accused of being a member of the KKK back in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just an anonymous hack, apparently, and it had a whole list of politicians and him on it. And news stories just started running with it and started blowing up on Twitter. But then people researched into it and they realized that he was actually an African American sheriff and he was being accused of being in the KKK.
Yeah.
Before they can even look into the guy, they were just running with the story that it was, and it was proven to be false.
Yeah, it's quite amazing how something like that can catch a lot of traction on social media, and people, because people will only selectively look for information that supports their own worldview, because of that tendency, people will buy into things that, even if you give it a moment's thought, possibly are not true or are far from the truth. And so people don't bother to investigate whether somebody's playing with them, somebody's messing with them, trying to get them to understand, and whether or not you are clickbait. You are a victim of clickbait. I mean, that's these common parlance, social media, this thing called clickbait. You're trying to get people just to click on your link so you can get more ad revenue. So there's this whole game going on, and there's a debate among social scientists of the people that are doing this. Are they the instigators? Are they truly pious? Do they really believe in their own lies, or are they completely cynical? Are they just trying to do it to boost their own status and to get possible ad revenue? Like with YouTube, that's how people make money. Is you get the more ads, the more views you get, the more ads are run on top of you, the more money you make. So there's this. You always have to take a lot of stuff with a grain of salt, and ask your own questions or be critical of everything you hear. So good. What else about this? Emily, and then we'll go up this way, my screen. Emily, go ahead.
I found an article it was a few years back from CNN, and it was saying that there were an increased number of homicides in Baltimore, but they only interviewed one single police officer. So I feel like that was kind of like selective observation, because they knew that single police officer would say that there were increased homicides. I think they could have asked multiple police officers, multiple departments in that area. I feel like that was just kind of like an generalization too.
Yeah, there's also a need for independent observations beyond what that one police officer says. That data should be publicly available. It's the homicide rate, so you can get that in any county, any town. That's something that's publicly available. So yeah, I mean, the media will sometimes do that. They'll want just someone's take. What's your gut feeling on this? And Carl Sagan says, I prefer not to think with my gut or any other part of my digestive system. I'd like to think with my brain. So he might says, well, just what does your gut say? Like he talks about in his book about how he went through this detailed explanation about what he thinks about extraterrestrial life, the possibility of it. And he gives this detailed explanation, like it's probably likely because of this, that, and that. And then the person follows up, but what do you really think? What does your gut tell you? It's like, what I just told you what I think. What do you just want to come up with some nonsense answer generated from my lower intestine? So it's just kind of, you get that a lot. And see where we're going. Rebecca, and then we'll go Anthony. Yeah.
Okay, I found a letter to the editor, and the person got banned from Facebook for a post, and he went as far as saying that the U.S. government was censoring speech like communist China. Mm-hmm. Figured that was like an overgeneralization, because he took one event that happened to him and like blew it up and made it like a big thing when it wasn't.
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. So overgeneralization, you guys are making a lot of hay out of that. And it is one that lends itself to a lot of examples that you see, like that one where this guy is, there's actually a specific term for that. They call it catastrophizing. When you catastrophize something, you take something that is a problem, but then expand it well beyond what is a reasonable comparison. And some people have this psychological tendency to catastrophize. To take something that is bothersome and could be problematic, but then expand it well beyond what other reasonable people might think is worth their concern. So that's another logical fallacy. Anthony, you had one.
Yeah, so in the one I found, basically a woman sued a TV station in Houston because they reported that she left her kids in a hot car, but in reality she was actually trying to get help, but they got evidence from one witness who said that she just left her kids in the car, so they believed that and then put the story out. But then a few hours later, more witnesses came forward, so their story wasn't true and they got sued. So I said that was definitely an example of overgeneralization.
Or selective observation, right? You're just you only go with one source, and that source is just one human being. It's like, you're in problems there. We need multiple witnesses. This is why in the court of law, we need corroborating evidence, right? You want to get evidence streams from multiple sources and see if they line up. People's stories match, all that kind of stuff. So this is not, the sort of things we talk about in this class is not limited just to sort of people in white lab coats in laboratories. This kind of thinking is very useful in the practice of law. In fact, this goes on all the time in a courtroom. You need cooperating evidence and independent observations where stories and evidence can all line up to point to one particular person. And so that kind of thinking, logical thinking goes well beyond what we think of strictly as science. What else, folks? Anything else on this where you encounter these logical errors in thinking? Yeah. Not sure if anybody else, I'm hearing a slight echo, but I'm not hearing anything else right now. I've got one I'm going to show you guys. Let me screen share with you. This was an email. If I can find this email, let me, if I can pull this up. It was somebody sent me this email. Here, let me pull this up real quick. Okay. Let's take just a second. See if I can get this to show you, so you can just read the email and see what this person is. Oops. Can you see my email now? People see that as the screen frozen? Oops. All right. Let's see, where did it go? This guy's name was Kevin, I think. Okay, here it is. Okay, so can you all see that? It says brains, brawn, and beauty. You see that up there? Okay, so the email, you may not be able to read this, but I along with a co-author of mine, we published this article using AdHealth data on the relationship between intelligence, physical beauty, and physical aggression, and the number of sex partners that people report over time. So the theory is that in the past, it would have paid off women. It would have been a big payoff for women to mate with a guy who is physically aggressive, to take care of business, because you're living in a land that is a land of anarchy. There's no law and order. There's no 911 to call. And that has psychological implications for women's sexual preferences today. The question is, though, does intelligence matter more so than just raw physical aggression? Because men today, outside a few lines of work like athletics and the military, that your physical prowess doesn't really matter as much as your IQ does anymore. And how does this compare to just like physical beauty? Well, it turns out that despite massive societal changes, that women, at least for short-term relationships, do tend to favor men who have a history of violence. It may not necessarily be because the men are violent. They may show dominance over other men. And for some women, that may make them feel safe and they will want to partner with these guys. And they may be great lovers for the short term, but maybe not long-term marriage material. And this is all else being equal. So this is accounting for their intelligence and just their physical beauty. That girls, it is true that girls to a certain extent do go for the bad boys. And so that was the basis of the article. This person wrote to me, and I don't have no idea who this guy is, but he wrote back to me and he said, I read the article because it came across my feed, but I do not agree with the correlation. I personally known many, many men who were very physical. Okay, so the fact that he's saying he personally knows somebody, that is selective observation connected to something we call homophily. So it doesn't really matter, no disrespect to this guy, but who he knows personally is not really something that should impact scientific thinking, because the chances are the people you know are like you in some respect. And so that's a logical fallacy that is committing right there, that it's not really relevant that he knows many, many men who are very physical. And then he refutes my argument that it has something to do with female mating preferences, the thing that why violence is correlated with men's accumulation of sex partners over time. He says the reason they would have more sex is because they did not have the same moral ethics and principles, not because they're necessarily perceived as more attractive. Well, okay, that might be true, but you would have to make an independent measure of somebody's moral ethics and measure that to make that argument. So I would have to then believe that women are attracted to men who are unethical, which to me strikes me as probably not right. I don't understand why that would work out. Why men who are afflicted with moral turpitude would be sexually appealing to women. So he's got another problem here where, okay, that's possible, but buddy, you're going to have to find out how, you have to figure out a way to measure someone's moral sensibilities. And I don't think I have to tell you all this, but women are not passive receptacles for penises. Typically, when sex is going on, and it's not coerced sex, women have a big say in who they're going to have sex with. And so if you find something in a multivariate analysis that predicts mating success among men, it probably suggests, not necessarily for sure, but it definitely suggests that women might find something attractive about the bros, about guys that are a little edgy, and at least for short-term relationships, have a couple drinks in the bar. This is what the argument we're basically making. And so this guy is also talking about, so he says, so yes, physical men having sex with more partners makes sense, but not because they're necessarily perceived as more attractive, is because they intentionally seek out more partners and values those partners less. Again, this takes women's decision-making completely out of the equation. Like if men are just morally debased, that's all it takes for them to get lucky all the time. And so, so there's problem. I understand where this person is coming from, but right off the bat, you can see logical errors in thinking that, well, okay, it's people you personally know, and you're not suggesting or even pointing to other research that you have some sort of measure of morals or ethics. And also it sort of implies in his statement that women are passive or play no active role in the men that they decide to date or have sex with. And so all of this I find somewhat problematic. So anyway, yeah, I mean, you get this a lot when you send out articles for review. People are supposed to be objective when they're reviewing it, but you get these statements that are a little odd, and you know, I'm not going to write this person back, you know. But anyway, that's another example of logical errors in thinking that sometimes occur among people who should know better, people who are also in the same business as me doing social science. They say things, they're like, okay, I see that's a reasonable alternative hypothesis, saying that men who lack moral principles are going to be getting lucky more often. Okay, well, I mean, we could test that. We could have some sort of measure of morality and survey men and see the ones who are really sort of scumbags. And if it's true that scumbags, after accounting for all the other factors that women find attractive, like how intelligent a guy is, how physically attractive he is, yes, how physically aggressive he is, if moral scumbaggery still comes out as being a significant predictor of men's mating success, okay, then this guy has something. But I think he's wrong. I just don't think that is what's going on. There's got to be something else that explains it. And you know, you can look at the article yourself. You might think it's shite. That's fine. But you got to have a good reason to say it's shite. You can't just say, well, I just don't like it because it rubs me the wrong way. It doesn't fit with my sensibilities. Well, you know, I mean, that's fine, but you know, you got to come up with a testable alternative hypothesis. And the hypothesis could be pretty wild, pretty far out there, right? But so long as it's testable, you have to find out some way to test it so that you could also be wrong in your assumptions. You just say, well, it's just moral turpitude, and don't define moral turpitude in any sort of really quantitative way, then it's not a testable hypothesis. It's just sort of an untestable thing that really has no value in science. That's more of a religious or political discussion. So, okay, folks, that was my little rant there about that guy's email. But anyway, any other comments about this baloney detection kit, which is really kind of honing your skills at like trying to find out if someone has something that's really worth listening to based on a testable hypothesis, or they're just blowing off steam. They want to generate heat instead of light. Any other examples of this kind of stuff? It's did a pretty good job doing this, but yeah, these are really common. And again, there are people on TV who are far smarter than me, but do this sometimes unconsciously or sometimes on purpose. It's the ones that are doing it on purpose that really bother me. I mean, humans, to be human is to err, right? So we're going to do this stuff without us really realizing it. But there are people, there are nefarious actors that do this stuff on purpose because they know that it works. It feeds into your vision of the world of how things should be, and that's what's can be dangerous about these logical errors in thinking. Okay, so any other comments about that? Should probably move ahead to the next set of stuff. Right. Okay, so let me share my screen with you for this slideshow. So we were talking about the beginning of chapter 2, and the chapter 2 starts off talking about errors in human inquiry that we had previously discussed. It also gets into all these different types of social theories, and it gives you a very short overview of the whole gamut of social theories, everything from like these critical or postmodernist theories to more mainstream sociological type theories, some of which are used quite heavily in the field of criminal justice and criminology. But I'm going to bring up one example of a theory that's really very popular among criminologists and has been ever since 1990. And before I do that, though, as my example, I want to define what a theory is. So a theory is not just like when two cops are talking and there's a dead body and someone says, hey, I got a theory about this. It's more than that. It's not somebody's just intuition about what's going on. A theory in the sciences is a much more specific thing. So it's a set of arguments that are testable based on prior empirical observation. So some data have to be collected and that they're logical, that is, they're internally consistent. That even if you don't have any data to support your theory, for your theory to even be in the realm of science, it has to be at least internally logic. There must be some internal logic. It must be logical in the sense that one thing follows from another. And so it also, for the theory to have any validity and reliability, it must improve the probability of making accurate predictions about X, about whatever it is, about crime, about sexual behavior, about educational attainment, whatever it is. It needs to be tested, and the good way to test it is that using this theory, can you make predictions about things that have not yet happened or things that are not yet observed? And so that is what makes for a good theory. So the theory that's really popular among criminologists and has been ever since it's come out, it's been modified ever since, but it's this Gottfredson and Hershey's theory, a general theory of crime, and it's all about self-control. And their whole argument is low self-control is what generates criminal tendencies, and also it's correlated with other things that we think are causes of crime at the individual level. So the theory goes like this. It's really quite simple. It's just inadequate parenting practices lead to low self-control in children. And so inconsistent love and inconsistent discipline of the child will result in a child that cannot hold his or her horses, doesn't know how to count to 10. Their emotions lead them. They're all id and no lit, as Freud would say. So they're all emotionally driven. They have poor impulse control. And so therefore, children with low self-control favor activities and relationships that offer immediate rewards but require little commitment. And so it's things that give you immediate gratification. Crime and what they call analogous risk factors. So poor school performance, permissive sexual activity, these things are correlated pretty strongly with crime. All these things satisfy these requirements of offering immediate reward, but requiring little commitment. So when talking about the accumulation of sex partners, in any large data set, you will find that criminal behavior and delinquency are strongly correlated with the number of sex partners or dating partners that people report. It's a strong positive correlation. So that's there's that there. And they would say, well, really what's going on is just it's low impulse control is predicting both the criminal behavior as well as the risky sexual behavior, as well as the poor school performance. That all of these bad things or risky things are being predicted by this one kind of master variable. And that's how much self-control, how much emotional control that kids develop. and that they say that therefore then children with low self-control will be more likely as adults to go to prison than children who develop high levels of self-control. And there's a tremendous amounts of empirical evidence to support this. Now, some criminologists and sociologists hate this theory because they say it's way too simple. They'll say, of course, poor impulse control probably does correlate with all these things, but one variable does not make a theory, that it needs to incorporate these sociological characteristics, peer characteristics, family background, all this stuff. And that, yeah, there's an argument to be made for that, but there's also something that is very attractive about this theory because it is simple. It's what they call, it's a parsimonious theory. It says that it's this one thing that is correlated with all these other things. And it turns out that it's true. And if you have a large data set and you have some measure of preferences towards impulsive behavior that are separate from criminal behavior, for instance, that measure of poor impulse control will be a strong predictor, at least a reliable predictor of criminal behavior, in addition to other risky behavior. And so there is something to be said about it. This is why this idea of low self-control, as simple as it is still around ever since 1990. It still gets a lot of citations because people have to contend with this, that it may not be someone's peer group, it may not be they don't like their teachers, it may not even be what exactly is going on in the home. It may be that what predicts a lot of this stuff is that it's the kid's own poor impulse control is causing problems with his or her parents, causing problems in the school, causing problems they cannot kind of maintain an appropriate intimate relationship with another person. They have a really hard time maintaining a job because they're showing up whenever they want, leaving whenever they want. They're just terrible employees. And so all the other things that criminologists may think are really causing crime, they would suggest if you have a really good measure of self-control, it will reveal all these things are really just kind of byproducts of the low self-control. And so you may think that, well, this is really kind of an unsatisfying theory, but it at least is a theory that is testable, okay? It's simple enough. And so we want to remember Occam's razor, that whenever you have a choice, an array of different potential explanations, always start testing the simplest ones first, mainly because they are testable, they are falsifiable. If you say that, well, this one thing does all this other stuff, that's very testable, as opposed to, well, it's everything under the sun does all of this. Well, testing that everything under the sun has a little bit of an impact on this outcome, that's really very unwieldy, and it's hard to know exactly if you're really getting a good global measure of everything possible that could impact crime or risky sexual behavior, etc. Okay, so that's one example of a theory. In the sciences and the social sciences, theories don't necessarily have to be intuitively appealing, even though this one is. They just need to be testable, and they just need to be logically consistent with their premises. They need to be logically, at least internally, consistent. Okay, so that is theory. There are at least two major ways that the book talks about how one goes about doing research. The first way that is discussed is something called idiographic, and it sounds a little like something that's idiosyncratic, and so that refers to like individual cases. And this is what idiographic research is, what is usually talked about when we're doing qualitative research or ethnography. So you're focusing on an individual biography, or anthropologists do ethnographies. They'll focus on individual tribes like the Yanomamo living in the Amazon basin, something like that. And so what this is this is looking at these biographical experiences, in this case, to explain someone's criminal behavior, because sometimes you want to do this kind of very detailed biographical description of why a person is criminal. So you might get from the story, this narrative about a person's stepfather was abusive, mother was unaffectionate, school was difficult, gangs offered solidarity. And through qualitative research, you can kind of weave this story together that makes sense out of why this person is the sad sack sitting in prison that you may not be able to get from survey research. That story may not emerge. Sometimes it is best just to have a tape recorder and let people talk. Make sure the informed consent. Just let them talk, and you'll get a story that is sometimes harder to see, even if you ask 1,000 questions on a survey. And so the bonus or the advantage of this is you do get a lot of detailed information, but it's on only usually a few cases. And so if you're about ready to make broad sweeping statements about women and men when it comes to crime or it comes to sexual behavior, it's going to be a hard sell if you're basing it on the qualitative interviews of just a dozen people. People are like, really? You're going to make that kind of broad sweeping statement? Or even worse, you make it a broad sweeping statements about differences in people who are different races, different ethnicities. Like a lot of people like, I wouldn't do that. You need a really large scale survey. And it's also limited, but it's limited in the ability to make inferences to other cases. And so that, I guess that was just what I was saying, that a lot of researchers want to make inferences out to a much larger number of people than what they had personal contact with. And so qualitative research is great for creating a story and narrative that helps to explain a person's behavior that you cannot get from a standard survey. However, it is usually you're limited to a relatively few number of cases, and you have a limited ability to make inferences about other cases. The book that the graduate students are reading for this course, Legacy is a Crime, that one's a little bit exceptional in the sense that it has, I think, how many qualitative interviews did we do? I think it was over 100 of them in that one. So that one's pretty big. That one gets to the point where you can almost even start treating the qualitative interviews as a quantitative piece. If you go through and code for certain words that come up, certain words that you want to flag as, for something, you can do that with qualitative data. But a lot of these qualitative studies, you want to be, it's really limiting in the sense that while you have detailed information about people, it's very hard to then turn around and make these broad sweeping inferences about a broader population, which is a lot of times what we want to do in the social sciences. Then there is what's called nomothetic research. And this is focusing on the general, and this is what is probably the most common in the social sciences. And so this is where you have a survey usually that is assessing a very large number of cases, like in the thousands. The AvHealth data set that we'll be taking a look at later on in this class, as when we get to the SPSS exercises, you are getting just the public sample, that publicly available sample. Anybody can look at this. You don't have to be a Merriwood student. Anybody can go on the website and download this stuff. But that's just a subsample of the larger sample. The subsample itself has 6,400 individuals in it. The biggest sample that you can get out of there is 90,000 students. So that's what we're talking. That's when we're talking about being able to make confidently making inferences about, what the heck are 16-year-old boys and girls up to? What are they like? What are they not like? To say that kind of general statement, you really want to have a very big sample size. And we'll get into the details later about sampling because you can't really say that you've taken a large proportion of any particular population. Populations are assumed to be infinite. So it's not about the proportion of the target population that you're taking. It's about the sample size. It's all about the sample size, really. That's what it comes down to. That's why when people do survey research, you want to have a couple thousand people, at least. Most of those surveys that you see advertised on CNN, like opinion polls based on presidential approval, usually they have about a couple thousand people in them, because it turns out you don't have to do that much more. If it's a well done sample, you will be representative of the entire American population with just a couple thousand people. If there's like almost 400 million people in the United States. So you can do it though with a couple, within a margin of error. We'll talk about, I'm getting ahead of myself. These are all things that that will make sense to you after this class. But yeah, the nomothetic focus on the general, quantitative research. And yeah, this is quantitative usually because you are assigning numerical values to observations. You need to code things. The simpler, the better. If there was, a parent-child relationship, was there abuse or was there not abuse? Now, yeah, that binary coding, 0-1 coding may be way too simple for this. You might think, well, really, that's more on a continuum. I can imagine somebody who is just kind of abusive, kind of neglectful, and then somebody who is really, really abusive and neglectful, and then parents, I guess, that are just perfect angels and never raise their voice to kids and whatever. Yeah, those parents don't exist. But the coding has to take place in some form, usually when you're doing quantitative research, as the term would imply, because eventually you're going to have to plug it into an Excel spreadsheet or SPSS spreadsheet and do some analyses and get answers. There is the drawback to this is that you can really you can get a lot of information on many cases, but it's less detailed information. You may miss the forest for the trees, as they say. You may not be really be able to understand, be able to weave a coherent narrative out of lots of data that's generated, unless you're a very astute student of statistics that you can sort of suss out what the story is based on a correlation matrix. It's hard to do. I'm getting a little bit better at it, after, 15 years of doing this stuff in grad school, plus being at Marywood. I'm getting a little bit better at doing that stuff, but it's tough to kind of tell a story about a person, sometimes based on just like a correlation, based on a correlation matrix. So it is limiting in the sense that you have limited information. You just have a bunch of correlations between your cases and these variables. But the bonus here, or the thing that's really this big selling point, is that you have a much greater ability to make inferences about other cases. And this statistical inferences are very important for all of the sciences, that we take a sample of something. It could be crickets, it could be people. You're taking a sample of something going on, involving subatomic particles, but then you want to make an inference that it's not just about your observation that's right in front of your face. It's about everything else that you are not observing directly. And so to make a statistical inference with a high degree of confidence, that usually takes quantitative research. It takes a large survey. Okay, so qualitative research are very important for kind of weaving a narrative that you may not be able to see when you're looking at correlation matrices, but the correlation matrices, yeah, that's a necessary evil. If you want to make broad sweeping statements about the effect of social class, the effect of X on crime for the population, that kind of thing usually requires a large-scale survey, which is why we have you take classes that deal with quantitative analyses. It's something that you have to do. Okay, so when we are talking about how we come up with our logical line of reasoning, there are basically just two approaches to this that the book points out. The first approach is what they call inductive reasoning. And so this is where your observations or your facts are used to build up a theory. And so you might observe that crime is more prevalent in low-income neighborhoods, that people in low-income neighborhoods also often lack contact with conventionally situated others, so people who are married, employed, and educated. So it may not be the money, really. It may be the fact that they just don't have really good guidance coming from other people who have their stuff together. And so then you say, okay, the crime is therefore caused by a lack of bonds with conventionally situated others. That's what's doing it. So it's not really the fact that they have a little money in their bank account. It's that they really they're not enmeshed within a network of other people who are conventionally situated. So it's really hard. Life can be really tough. And so people need other people as guidance. And so when you don't have that, you can see this very well in low-income neighborhoods. It's not just the fact that they don't have money. It's they don't have a lot of other things that we sometimes take for granted that we have, that have kind of kept us on the straight and narrow, and we're at Marywood and not sitting in a jail cell somewhere. Okay, so that's inductive reasoning. You can do it backwards. Backwards is called deductive reasoning. You start with a grand theory. You say, I think a general theory is this theory, and this helps to explain the correlation between poverty and crime. So you might start off, well, I know a lack of social bonds with conventionally situated others is the cause of most crime. At least in theory, that I think if you don't have these bonds, then you are going to be more likely, all else being equal, to be involved in criminal behavior. And that people in low-income neighborhoods, they often lack contact with conventionally situated others. Therefore, you find that people located in these low-income neighborhoods should therefore have a greater likelihood of criminal involvement. And then you can go and look at people in low-income neighborhoods and test your theory and see if that's correct. You would look at the level of low income that they have, and then start taking independent measures of, okay, what is the proportion of people who are married, proportion of people employed, the proportion of people that are educated beyond high school. And that you will find, yeah, it does seem to be true that this general theory of, sometimes it's called social bonding theory, it's a type of social control theory, that social bonds seem to be lacking among the poor. So it may not be just the income, and you could measure that separately. You might be like, well, it's not just that, it's just that this guy is not married. He doesn't have any other, maybe he doesn't have stable employment, and that's what's doing it. It makes him feel like, he's worthless, and so crime seems like a reasonable option. He's got, he doesn't have much to lose, so there's that kind of thing going on that provides support for your theory. And so inductive reasoning, you start with observations. Deductive reasoning, you start with a theory and then start making the observations to support it. These things, of course, are interrelated to one another. You can think of this as kind of like a cyclical relationship, where one inductive reasoning informs deductive, and then the deductive informs the inductive. So you can think of this as kind of a cycle or a circle that helps, that's mutually reinforcing. So okay, let me move forward here real quick to this next one. We have measurement as a major task in the social sciences. Measurement is something that must be done not only with quantitative research, but also qualitative research. A little bit more difficult to do in qualitative research, but in quantitative research, it's kind of easier. Once you get over your statistics anxiety, it's really more straightforward to do quantitative research. How quantitative research is often done in social sciences, it's oftentimes a study of groups and not individuals. And so this is called aggregated data. And so if data is aggregated, it means it's a collection of data from lower levels of observations to inform the characteristics of a higher level observation. And so you're talking about averages in certain areas, rates, or proportions of something. And so you might talk about the homicide rate in Scranton versus the homicide rate in Detroit. And so many of you probably know what a homicide rate is already. It's the number of people killed in a year, murdered in a year, divided by the total population, usually times 100,000. So it's murdered per 100,000. It doesn't matter what you could say per 10,000 people. It would just change the scale. But the FBI reports it's for the country, and for individual states, it's the number of people murdered divided by that population times the constant 100,000. You get the homicide rate. And so that is important to know what the homicide rate is, because the rate of homicide tells you more accurately what is the chances that little old you will be the victim of a homicide, and if you live in this neighborhood, rather than the overall number of homicides, because the overall number of homicides will go up almost just naturally because of the number of people in a city. So cities are always going to have higher homicide raw numbers than what rural areas will, because there's more people in the cities than in the rural areas. But that's why you want to look at the rates, because some rural areas have homicide rates that are far higher than cities. Some of these areas that are in Appalachia, where they have really high levels of homicide, domestic violence, opiate abuse, and stuff like that. So it's not nearly the numbers that you have in a place like Detroit, but the rates are really high. So that suggests that the average person in that vicinity has a higher likelihood than this person over here living in the city of falling into terrible drug abuse or being a victim of homicide. The life expectancy, you can look at the life expectancy in 1900 versus 2010 or 2021, and look at the change. And so that's not the life expectancy of an individual, it's the life expectancy of the whole population. And it can be broken down into smaller aggregate groups like men versus women, whites versus blacks, Hispanics versus Asians, et cetera, et cetera. So you could do that. And then you could do also what the next couple lines are saying is that you could do this by marital infidelity, so male versus female. You could say the proportion of men who admit to messing around on their wives versus the proportion of wives who admit to messing around on their husbands. Typically, there's a higher proportion of men saying that, yes, I've had sex with other people while I was married versus women saying this. And then, of course, you could look at the proportion of blacks or African Americans who are incarcerated versus the proportion of whites who are incarcerated. So that says nothing about any individual person in society. So this is where sometimes people make mistakes, is that they will use aggregate level statistics and then apply it to certain individuals that they know. And that is where you can look like a real fool. You don't want to do that. You don't want to say, of course, you don't want to say, well, because I know there's higher incarceration rates, higher crime rates among African Americans, I'm going to be less likely to hire one because there's a risk that that person will have likelihood of being a criminal. That's where people get in trouble for discrimination, is because what they're doing is using aggregate level statistics to make inferences about an individual case. And you can't do that. It's not just a politically correct thing either. It's just logically inconsistent with how statistics works. That's why it's a problem. I mean, yeah, there's a whole other problem of making sure not being rude and not, being politically incorrect, but that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about just a logic issue that you can't take an aggregate statistic and say anything about an individual person unless you have data on that individual person. Okay, so that's aggregate data is very good to talk about big group differences and talk about trends over time and different rates between areas, but we cannot go on and make a inference about any individual person. Okay, so that's where aggregate data can sometimes get people in trouble. When we are measuring something that varies in the population or varies across individual cases, like someone's age or someone's race or the number of times that they drank in the past month, it is not the same. It's not a constant across all your observations. It varies. So it's called a variable. Okay, so variables are things by definition that they will be different across observation. So your units of observation might be, they might be counties, they might be individuals, they might be neighborhoods, but so long as they vary across observations, it is by definition a variable, as opposed to a constant, which is the same for everyone, or at least same for all your observations. So variables are things by definition that the numerical values that that are associated with them will vary across observations. And so these variables then also have various attributes that are associated with them. So age would have the attributes of, you could have infants, children, adults, elderly, and this is all measured in what we call an ordinal type scale. We know elderly are older than infants. We know adults are younger than elder. We don't know exactly how much difference we're talking about here. Or we can measure it in a continuous fashion in years. So we know exactly how many years different one observation is from the rest. These variables, when we measure these things, variables are commonly measured when assessing the risk of delinquency involve things like age, gender, family structure. So age is one of the very, very, very best predictors of crime that many of you know. There's this thing called the age crime curve. people's risk of criminal behavior starts to go up really quick or really rapidly shortly after puberty. It peaks around age 18 or 19, and then it declines pretty quickly after age 21. There's an age crime curve that goes on. And so age is a really good predictor of crime. Most people age out of crime. There's a very strong, even among more hardcore offenders, people just age out of it. Gender is a very good predictor of crime, especially violent crime. That's primarily a male preoccupation. Family structure is another very good predictor of crime, and so family structure is measured in terms of one parent, two parent home, that kind of thing. And so these are variables because they will vary across observation, and they have these attributes associated with them. And so these allow researchers to infer relationships beyond a single sample of persons. And so you can say, well, because in this sample these two variables correlate, I think this is saying something about the broader population. That in my sample I found that kids from single parent homes do tend to not only fare worse in school, but they also tend to get in trouble more often. Therefore, I think that in the population generally, what's going on when you see a large proportion of single parent homes, you will see these associated problems. And yeah, you tend to find that. The other thing that you would like to do when you have a variable that could be measured in a reliable and valid way is to make inferences that are causal, that you would like to say that the values of the independent variables, if not cause, influence the values in the dependent variables. And so if you would say, for example, I think it's an issue of an unstable family background that is causing variation in the outcome crime, then what you would see if your theory is correct is that in a large data set you would find that those people who reported coming from something other than a two-parent family background are more likely to report criminal involvement. And you should then see that correlation. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's causing that for sure, but if it is correct, at least if the theory has any empirical support, then what you should find is that as you've defined it, the independent variable, in this case family structure, is having an influence on the dependent variable, the outcome that is crime, rather than the other way around. And so we will get into the criteria for causation in greater detail, if not this class, a little bit later in the next class. But we want to be able to say one thing has a causal impact on something else. We want to be able to say that this thing here explains why these observations are varying in the way that they are varying. And so in order to do that, we need to be able to set up, at least theoretically here, okay, what we think are the independent variables, what we think are the things that are having an impact on the dependent variables, which is the outcome. Okay, and so that is something else that we want to try to accomplish when we are measuring variables. We want to see that there's some statistical relationship. It might imply causal inference, if not prove it. It's very hard to prove these things sometimes, especially in the social sciences. But we usually do this in terms of measuring these things independently. And if we think that if X has an effect on Y, then we're calling X the independent variable and Y is the dependent variable. And that if X is high, then Y will be high, or if X is low, then Y will be low. That that's the examples of positive correlations. That there should be some correlation or some association between these two things. So a little bit more about some of the differences between qualitative versus quantitative interpretations when it comes to measuring variables, to measuring the things that you're interested in your study. And so when we look at something like age, okay, age 15 versus 16, that's 1 year difference. But we all know very well, when teenagers turn 16 years of age, there is a whole other array of things that come up because they can drive a car. Because they can drive a car, that opens up all kinds of freedoms and potential risks for them. So it's not just one more birthday. It's a whole other range of possibilities now that can impact your observations in your survey. There is a qualitative difference. There is a qualitative difference between age 15 and 16 that is not immediately apparent when you just look at the quantitative difference, because it's just 1 year difference. But because of the ability to get a driver's license at age 16, bedroom on wheels, and the party in the back seat, all this stuff starts happening, and so there's all these things that make 16-year-olds quite qualitatively different than 15-year-olds, and it's not just that they're 1 year older. And so, of course, that is obvious to us as human beings being socialized in the United States. We know this is true, but these are the kind of things that may not be so obvious with other variables that you're measuring. When you go up a variable scale, there may be a break in the numbers that it just looks like it's just going up one more quantitative value, but really there's something going on there that makes it qualitatively different. I mean, is it really a whole different thing? Okay, you go to jail once. Okay, that was a really bad experience, too much drinking, just stupidity at the bar. Okay, but once you get to 3 or 4 times in jail, that might start affecting you in a completely different way than the difference between 1 or 2 times in jail. And so it's these sort of things that that may not be completely obvious to us, as this example might be. There might be a qualitative difference in addition to the quantitative difference, in this case between age 15 and 16. Another example, difference between 3 years of dating and 3 years of marriage. So 3 years of dating and 3 years of marriage, quantitatively, those are the same thing. But 3 years of marriage, for a lot of people, that really means a lot more than 3 years of dating, even you're talking about the same person, because you are now married, and this is much heavier, because the assumption is that this goes on until you are both dead, right? Until one of you dies, that you are married. Whereas dating, even if you're dating somebody for a long time, it's still in the back of your mind, like, this is just temporary. This can end any time without really no legal hassle. You don't have to get a lawyer or anything involved. You just say, okay, this is not working. We should just save each other a lot of heartache and just break up. So it's a lot easier for people who are dating for 3 years versus people who are married for 3 years. That's a qualitative difference. Quantitatively, you just look at duration of relationship. In a survey, you might say, well, this person's together for 3 years. This pair is together for 3 years. This couple's together for 3 years. They're both together for 3 years. But 3 years of marriage may be much more significant emotionally, socially in marriage. Marriage and cohabitation has that same sort of implication, because cohabitors, even though that their relationship quality may seem like it's about the same, it's like a marriage in every single way, except for the fact that they don't have a marriage certificate. There's still in the mind of cohabitors, there's still a possibility that this is still, you can walk away from this thing a lot easier, and legally you can. And so, cohabiting relationships tend to be, perhaps no surprise, less stable than marriages, because there's not the sort of cultural and legal ramifications that come along with marriage and cohabiting relationships. And so that's one of the reasons why it's a lot of people in relationship counseling tend to suggest that cohabiting for extremely long periods of time may not be the best thing for your relationship. If you guys can't sort of decide to go ahead and tie the knot, then you might want to reassess, well, what are you doing together? Are you really kind of looking for an excuse to get out of this? So so that's a qualitative difference that's not apparent when you're just looking at relationship status. Another one, just kind of hit this or bring this on home here. You could look at murder, killing a homeless drunk with a broken bottle versus intentionally running over an elderly woman with your car. this, if you don't know the background of sort of the motives and the context of a homicide, most homicides are accidents, or at least they're not something that was pre-planned. I shouldn't say most homicides are accidents. They would be considered manslaughter. But a lot of homicides are not planned. They happen spur of the moment. And it's really hard maybe to know just how much intention was behind the homicide. But it makes a lot of difference in a court of law if you can show someone intentionally did something versus doing something that was a result of, you know, heat of passion. You were fighting, and you happened to you pick up a bottle because you were afraid for your life, and you hit the homeless guy over the head with a bottle. So if you just look at the number of times someone was involved in this, it would look at, okay, this person was involved in one homicide incident, and this person over here was involved in one homicide incident. So in that sense, they're equal because they both have quantitatively the same amount of homicides that they're involved in. But the person who intentionally runs over an elderly woman with their car seems like a far more malicious and dangerous person than someone who maybe is drunk themselves and gets in fight with a homeless person with a broken bottle in a heat of passion. Okay, so these things, there's a qualitative difference, and the courts will argue this all the time when we're talking about how much time a person deserves, how culpable they are for an offense, how deserving they are of punishment, all these things that we typically talk about in criminal justice type classes. So this brings up a question, because there are real limitations sometimes with quantitative data. There's also limitations with qualitative, but because there's real limitations with quantitative data, people are sometimes skeptical of statistics, and rightfully so. But most social scientists, even though they're social scientists, they are still very quantoid type people. They really want to break everything down into something that we measured with numbers, but it can be very tricky to do. This is where, like, physicists and people in the hard sciences always will have an advantage of the people in the social sciences, because in the hard sciences, you can have a very accurate way, a no-nonsense way of measuring things, like measuring heat and things like that. That's very straightforward. But in the social sciences, we want to know about things that are a lot dicier and harder to measure in any really accurate way. You may think that the reason why people are unemployed is it has something to do with their own motivation, how lazy individuals are. That you might think, well, I think in the population, people's laziness is something that could be measured quantitatively. You might also say that I think really what's going on with relationship duration or marital duration is just how much people love one another. I know that sounds like a trite, sort of almost hokey statement to say that, but I really think that people's degree of love for one another really does vary. Some couples just actually don't really love each other that much. Others could not live without one another, and people vary in this characteristic we call love. And for the quantoid, the quantitative social scientist, his or her job is to come up with a way to measure this. Likewise, you might think that what really predicts the number of sexual partners that people accumulate over a lifetime is how lustful they are. Some people really are much more driven to have a broad variety of mating partners. It's more clearly seen among men, but also among women as well, that some women are much more okay than other women in having a lot of short-term relationships. And so lustful may be kind of a salacious way to label this kind of thing, right? You might think of a less kind of dicey way to say it, but you might think some people's appetite for sexual variety is just greater than other people's appetite. Some people are really okay with monogamy. Some people are much more polyamorous, and they just can't, they're much more open to and interested in having sex with lots of different people. Okay, and so the population is big, it varies, and likelihood is you take a large enough sample, you're going to get variations in these things. And so let's wrap this class up by hearing from maybe one or two people who haven't said anything yet about how might we measure laziness in a quantitative way? How might we measure love in a quantitative way? How might we measure lust in a quantitative way so that it is a reliable predictor of these outcomes? Give it a couple minutes, but if something occurs to somebody right away, just shout it out. So again, we want to break this down to the simplest, kind of dumbest way we can measure this stuff. So we can give it out to a bunch of people. The survey questions are often suggested to be written at the 6th grade reading level. And so it could be a series of questions like, how would we tap into the degree of like how lazy a person is, how loving or how bonded people are in a relationship, and maybe how lustful or how open and interested people are in relationships with a broad number of sexual partners, because the population clearly varies in these things. The job of the social scientist is to come up with a quantitative way to measure these things that at first glance seem like you can't break that down into a bunch of numbers. But a lot of quantoids would say, yes, you can, and you have to. If you want to do this right, we have to agree upon how we're going to measure this in a quantitative way. We can't just do the qualitative thing, because then it's open to subjective interpretation, and we're not going to be able to do qualitative interviews with 5,000 people. It's not going to happen. So we need to come up with a survey of how we would measure a scale of laziness, a scale of lust, a scale of love. So any ideas on this, on how we would go about doing this? How could you make a measure that discriminates between people who are laziness, that are people who are like constantly just job seeking, alpha on the top of everything all the time, and then on the far end of the other scale, people who are total couch potatoes, and it's like, oh my God, I could light a fire on that couch and you would still sit there, like that kind of thing. And then everybody in between, because we want to get the full range. We don't want just to measure the tails of the distribution. We want the full range of laziness. Likewise for all these other things that, again, at first glance seem like that's purely a qualitative thing. Like, no, I would say you can quantify this. You can attach numbers to this kind of thing. Any ideas on that? The trick is with some of this, you don't want to necessarily use the word laziness or love or lust in the question. You don't want to tip your hat off. You don't want to show your cards to the survey takers. Oftentimes, you want to use language that's not as provocative as like lust or laziness because of social desirability bias. Even if a person is just a lazy couch potato, the guy does not want to know that he's answering questions that finger him as a lazy couch potato. You want to kind of work this in gently and kind of a tactful way that you really are tapping into how lazy people are. But you don't want to do it in a way to sort of show your hand. You want to the trick for a lot of social scientists, they want to do it in kind of a sly way that still measures in a valid and reliable way the thing that you're ultimately interested in, but not do it in a way so that it is clear to the survey taker that they're trying to figure out how lazy I am, or they're trying to figure out how much I am, how lustful I am, or, love one may be a little bit more, maybe doesn't kind of lend itself to social desirability bias as much, but social desirability bias is something we have to watch for in survey research, because people want to be people pleasers. They do. And so they'll just say whatever they think maybe you want or what they think is socially acceptable. So you got to watch that when you do this stuff. So these words are kind of provocative words that you probably wouldn't actually want to use in your survey.
I think I might have an idea for these.
Okay, Kyle. Yeah, sure.
I think it would just be a very simple way to do it, but you could just do like a 1 to 5 scale with like any given situation. So for like laziness, for example, like how likely would you be to go on a hike? Then 1 to 5, very likely, not likely, that kind of thing. And then just do a bunch of those situations over and over again until you get a broad enough representation of that person. And then just give the same line of questioning to everybody.
Yeah, Kyle, that's good. And that is generally true for a lot of surveys. There's no one question that we have any confidence in measuring what we really want to measure. So what we usually do, we play the game Ask 20 Questions. And all of these questions, even though they have different language in them, they look like they're different questions. They're all supposed to be measuring the same thing. And then to validate your measure, you want to look to see if the responses on these questions are all correlated in a predictable way. So if all of these questions, the higher the score you get, the less lazy you are indicating you are, they all should be positively correlated. If they're not, then that would suggest that they're really measuring different things, and you can't go forward with any confidence to say that this is really all these items are a measure of this underlying variable, this underlying construct. So yeah, that's exactly what you want to try to do, and that's usually what we have to do in the social sciences, because we're not physicists. We don't have an accurate measure of things that physicists like to measure, like heat. It just doesn't exist in criminology or sociology. So we have to usually ask a series of questions, and that's what is sometimes referred to as developing an index or a scale of something. So when psychologists measure depression, they don't just ask people, "Are you depressed?" They have a whole bunch of questions that are symptoms. They're measuring symptoms of depression, like do you sometimes, for reasons inexplicable, have a hard time getting up in the morning? You have there's all these little things that by themselves, they don't really look like they're measuring mental depression. But we know from empirical observation that people who are suffering from depression will have problems with fatigue. And so it's not just about feeling sad. Sometimes that's a misunderstood a condition associated with depression. Yeah, there's sadness, but there's also physical symptoms like feeling fatigued a lot. That's a sign of depression. And so what psychologists do, they have worked on this for years now. They've come up with scales of depression that ask 20 questions, and none of them, I don't think, actually say the word depressed in them. Well, maybe the one item does say, how often do you feel depressed? And so, but when they do that, all the other items that are supposed to be measuring depression should be strongly correlated with that one item that actually has the word depression in it. And then they can say, okay, they put all these, then you have like a score, a depression score based on all these items that all these items that you responded to. And they do the same thing with like personality tests. Like they can't just determine that you are an extroverted person with a high tendency towards neuroses based on just a couple questions. Usually it's a whole range of questions. Okay, folks, anything last minute, because we're about at the end of class here, anything else that people would like to mention on this stuff about measuring stuff? Okay, and yeah, somebody wrote me a note earlier about it is 8 out of 12 of those these chapter questions that you have to respond to. The next question that I have that I think is due on the 27th, the question I have in my book, and if people just want to know, it is see the question. What did I say? Let me take off of this thing real quick, and I'm going to go to my just a moment, folks. I just want to make sure that I am. Oops. Let me have to click back to this, I guess, to let me show you it. Okay, just messing around with Boodle. Okay, here we go. Okay, so yeah, I asked you to do question 2 and in chapter 2. And that one says review the relationships between theory and research discussed in this chapter. Select a research article from an academic journal and classify the relationship between theory and research Fine there. Okay, so yeah, this is one where I'm asking you to find an article and upload it. So that's the question anyway for tomorrow. And so you can have that due by midnight tomorrow if you're going to do that, and we'll talk about that in class as well on Thursday. Okay, folks, that's it for today. Thank you very much. Good job participating, those who participated. And I'll look forward to seeing you 1 o'clock on Thursday. So, all right, take care. If there's something else you want to talk to me about, you can stick around. I will be here for the next couple minutes. Bye-bye.